Late July, 1014. In the Belasica mountains, 15,000 men are walking single file down a goat track, roped to one another at the elbow in groups of 100. 99 men in every group have no eyes. The 100th has one. He is walking the others home. The air smells of pine resin and the iron tang of pus and crusted blood. Cicadas are loud in the slopes above the track. Somewhere below the column, in a ravine, the river Strumeshnitsa is running over flat stones in a thin summer voice. The lids of the blind men have been seared shut with a hot blade and then crusted over by the heat of the days that have followed. The one-eyed leader at the front of each rope counts the men behind him by the small jerks the rope makes against his arm. 99 jerks. They are about 15,000 by John Skylitzy's count, or about 14,000 depending on which manuscript of the synopsis historian you trust. The number, like every number in this story, has spent 1,000 years drifting between scribes. This is not the moment a battle ended. This is the moment a war that had run for more than 50 years was decided. And the man who decided it was an emperor who had spent 36 years on a throne and slept in a black monastic tunic under his purple, and never married, and never softened. By the count Michael Psellos gives in the Chronographia, written 2 generations after the campaign, the emperor had begun every spring on horseback since he was a young man. He ate the bread his soldiers ate. He kept his beard short and ungroomed, and his hair cropped, and he spoke with the men in their own dialects, the soldier Greek of the Eastern themes and the Slavic tongue of the Balkan recruits. Psellos almost certainly idealizes him. He wrote at the Komnenian dawn, when the soldier emperor had become a useful contrast to softer rulers. But the bones of the portrait survive in other writers, including Yahya of Antioch, who was an Arab Christian working from inside the Fatimid orbit and had no reason to flatter a Byzantine. Skylitzes, writing roughly a generation later from inside the bureaucracy that had inherited the conquest, gives the scene almost without comment. By his own admission, he is condensing earlier sources he no longer names. Quote 0, he writes, quote 1. I read that passage in the synopsis historian 3 times before I noticed what it isn't saying. Skylitzes does not call this monstrous. He does not flinch, and he does not boast. He notes a number. He notes a procedure. He moves on into the diplomatic afterwards, the way a quartermaster lists losses and then closes the ledger. The horror in the line, if you are looking for it, is in the absence of any horror in the prose. He also does not tell us where the blinding was carried out. He does not say how many days it took. He does not name the man who sharpened the irons. He does not record whether the strategos in command of the camp argued with the emperor at any point about whether all of this was necessary, or whether the suggestion had come from the emperor's own staff. In Skylitzes, the deed sits on the page already done, the way the result of a vote sits on the page in the Senate minutes. Without process, only outcome. The chronicle does not name the day. The emperor's name was Basil II. Modern Greek calls him Vulgaroktonos, the Bulgar slayer. The chronicles of his own century do not. That epithet attaches to him later, sometime after his death, and on the question of when exactly, modern scholars are split. Paul Stevenson has argued the surname grew up in the 12th century on the back of the Komnenian rediscovery of his memory, while Catherine Holmes treats Skylitz's account itself as basically credible, sitting close to a military culture that remembered the campaigns firsthand. The truth probably lives somewhere between those 2 readings, and I will come back to it before this story closes. For now, hold the picture. Hold the rope between elbows. Hold the one-eyed leader squinting down a Macedonian track that he half remembers from before this war started, when he was perhaps a boy. The Tsar he is walking back toward, the old man for whom these columns are coming home, is 70 or perhaps closer to 80, depending on which Armenian recension of Stephen of Taran you read. He has outlived 3 of his own brothers. He has outlived his eldest son's wife and his own designated heir's loyalty. He has, by the time these columns are forming up in the Strimoshnitsa Valley, been at war with Constantinople for almost the whole of his adult life. And he has held a state together across the Hemus and the Vardar and the Pindus by the force of one obstinate temper. This is the story of how an emperor who counted everything, taxes, soldiers, days, mountains, broke a kingdom that had refused to break for 4 decades by walking a flanking column over the wrong ridge of an unimportant pass, and then, having won, doing something so cold that even his own chroniclers can only describe it the way you describe weather. There is a Chekhov's rifle I want to plant here, plainly, because it will fire in the last part of this story. The flanking column over the wrong ridge will be commanded by a strategos named Nikephoros Xiphias, and Xiphias is one of those names that the chronicles introduce so quietly that you almost miss him. He has been with the army for years. He knows the upland trails because he has spent winters with the locals who use them. When Skylitzes writes him into the narrative at Clydeon, it is in a single sentence. He goes around the mountain. That sentence is the war. To understand why Basil II did this, and why the man waiting for those columns at Prespa would die looking at them, you have to go back to a different emperor, a different mountain, and an ambush that nearly ended the Macedonian dynasty before it had really begun. 28 years before Clydeon, a younger Basil had lost an army in a pass not far from where we are standing now. The lesson he took out of that pass is what we have come here to follow. The pass was called the Gate of Trajan, the Trajanopolis defile. The chronicles use both names. It cut through the Sredna Gora range on the road from Triaditsa, modern Sofia, back toward Constantinople. In August 986, an army was marching south through it under the command of an emperor not yet 30. He had been crowned at 3. His teens had been spent inside a court controlled first by the chamberlain Joseph Bringus, then by the strategos Bardas Phocas, then by the eunuch Parakoimenos Basil Lekapenos. He had never commanded troops in the field. He had besieged Triaditsa for 20 days. He had failed to take it. He was retreating. The Bulgarian column that hit him in the pass was led by the youngest of 4 brothers, the so-called Komitopoli, sons of the Count. The eldest, David, was dead. The second, Moses, was dead. Aaron III was drifting toward the wing of the Brotherhood that wanted to negotiate with Constantinople. The fourth and youngest was Samuel, already a soldier with 20 years of frontier war behind him. What happened in the pass, the chronicles describe in fragments. Leo the deacon, who was actually present in the army that day, he was a clergyman attached to the imperial household, and the only major Byzantine source who could say he had been on the ground, describes a defile filled with Roman dead and pack animals and armor scattered down the slope into a stream. The Bulgarians had taken the imperial parasol, the great gold-shot canopy that travelled above the emperor's tent. They had taken horses and standards. Leo himself only got out of the pass by riding hard on a borrowed animal. The young emperor lost the bulk of his European field force in a day. He limped back to Constantinople. He was 27 by Yahya of Antioch's count, or 28, depending on whether you reckon from his coronation or from his birth in 958. He came home to a court that had stopped taking him seriously. Psellos, writing decades later for a courtly audience that wanted a moral, gives us the conversion narrative. A frivolous prince, broken in a pass, returns to the city, sheds his soft clothes, puts on a black habit, and is somebody else from that morning forward. Psellos is too good a writer to be wrong, and too rhetorical to be entirely right. What we can say with some confidence is that within 2 years of the pass, Basil was on the field in person, and the men around him began to die. Lekapinos was exiled. Bardas Skleros, who had revolted twice, was pardoned but emptied of independent power. Bardas Phokas, who revolted again in 987, was destroyed at Abydos on Easter Sunday, 989, and the chroniclers say the emperor personally led the cavalry charge that broke him, with the icon of the Theotokos lashed to his saddle. By 989, the boy from the pass was beginning to be the man we recognize. He slept in a military tent in the courtyard of the great palace, even in winter. He kept Friday fasts the courtiers found embarrassing. The court historians, trained in panegyric, did not know what to do with him. Their genre wanted festivals. The emperor was eating a soldier's bread out of a soldier's bowl in a wet camp on the Strymon. Samuel, in those years, was building. The kingdom we now call the First Bulgarian Empire had been broken by John Tzimiskes in 971, when the Byzantines took the eastern capital at Preslav, captured the Tsar Boris II, and ceremonially stripped him of his imperial insignia inside the Hagia Sophia. The reality was that the western half of the country, Ohrid, Prespa, the Vardar Valley, had never been physically occupied. Into that vacuum, the four Komitopuli had moved. By 988, when his brother Aaron was killed on Samuel's order, with most of Aaron's family executed in a single afternoon, Samuel was the sole ruler. Whether the killing happened exactly as Skylitzes describes it is a smaller dispute. Stephen of Taran records Aaron's death without the family massacre. I lean towards Skylitzes because the consequence of one survivor, Aaron's son, John Vladislav, spared as a child, is too consequential to be a literary garnish. That boy will eventually murder Samuel's son and take the throne. Samuel pushed his borders outward. In the mid-980s, he took Larissa in Thessaly and transferred its population, including the relics of the local saint Achilleos, north to his capital, where he built a basilica for the saint on an island in the lake at Prespa. Across the years, either side of the turn of the century, he ranged as far south as the Peloponnese and campaigned against the Croats. He carried his own kingdom on his own horse. The two kingdoms collided most catastrophically in 997 on the river Spercheios. Samuel, returning north with prisoners and plunder, was caught at a river crossing in a flash flood by the Byzantine strategos Nikephoros Uranos, who hit the strung-out column from across the water. Samuel and his son Gabriel Radomir escaped barely, riding into the night with arrow wounds. The army did not. Yahya gives 12,000 Bulgarian dead, or 6,000, depending on the manuscript. That Samuel got out alive at the Spercheios, rode out of a disaster carrying a wound, and went on for 17 more years, is the detail that decides everything. Without it, there is no Clydeon. From 1001 onward, the rhythm of the war hardens. Basil had finished by then with internal revolts and with the Fatimids on the eastern frontier. Everything he had not yet finished with was Samuel. He began the campaign pattern that would run for 13 years. Every spring, the imperial army marched out of Adrianople or Thessaloniki, depending on the year, and probed along a different stretch of the Bulgarian frontier. Every autumn, it withdrew to winter quarters. He took Shredets in 1001, then Badin, Skopje, and Pernik in the years following. He did not chase Samuel into a set-piece battle. He ate the country a fortress at a time. Yahya of Antioch describes the campaign as something the emperor quote underscore, quote underscore, underscore. That line I cannot get out of my head. Like a man clearing a field. By 1014, after 13 consecutive seasons, the field was almost clear. Samuel's strategy through these years was the strategy of any smaller power against a relentless larger one. trade space for time, hold the mountain passes, refuse open battle, wait for the larger power to run out of patience, or stumble into a succession crisis. The geography of his kingdom was made for it. Between the Vardar River and the Aegean coast lay the Belasica Range, a forested ridge running east-west, climbing to peaks of 2,000 meters. The river Strumeshnitsa cut a defile through the western end of that range. The defile was called in those years the Clydeon, the Greek word for key, because it locked the pass between the upper Strymon Valley and the Vardar Basin. Samuel had fortified it the way a man fortifies the door of his own house. Timber palisades thrown across the narrowest section, earthworks behind. Garrisons drawn from the Slav highland levies, the men who knew every track on every slope. What the chronicles do not say is what Samuel was thinking in those last years. He was very old. By 1014 his heir, his son Gabriel Radomir, was an able soldier, but his nephew John Vladislav, Aaron's surviving son, raised at Samuel's own court, was already drifting, by Skylitz's testimony, toward a private resentment that would mature into a regicide a year after Clydeon. The chronicle does not show us the old man deciding to wait for Basil in the pass. It shows us only that he had decided it, and that the palisades were already in place when the imperial army came up the river in July. The serpent of the imperial column was sliding into the bottle of the Strumeshnitsa valley. The Tsar in the palisade meant to seal both ends. The imperial army came up the Strumeshnitsa in column. Skylitz's does not give the order of march, but the standard pattern for a Byzantine field force on a constricted line of advance, reconstructed from the Tactica of Leo VI and corroborated by Kekaumenos's Strategikon, was a vanguard of light cavalry, a screen of skirmishers, the heavy infantry of the Tagmata in the centre, with the emperor and his guard, the supply train behind, and a rear guard of mixed horse and foot. On a road squeezed between river and slope, the column had to thin to perhaps 4 men abreast. It was the height of summer. The men were marching in lamella and mail, in a valley that traps heat the way an oven traps it. The water in the river was low. Somewhere up ahead, around the bend, was the palisade. When the vanguard came in sight of the Bulgarian works, the column halted on its own, before any order had been sent back along the line. Skylitz's does not describe the palisade in detail. Byzantine chroniclers are nearly always laconic about fieldworks. The reconstruction we have, combining the chronicle with the local archaeology around modern Cluj in North Macedonia, suggests a wall of bound oak and beech trunks lashed across the narrowest point of the defile, perhaps 4 or 5 meters high, with a parapet for archers and a ditch on the Byzantine side. Behind it, on rising ground, sat the Bulgarian field army, smaller than Basil's, but in a position where size barely mattered. The southern slopes were patrolled by light infantry. The northern slopes were thought to be impassable. That had been Samuel's argument with the geography for 13 years. The Belasica ridge was too steep, too high, too thickly wooded to bring a body of soldiers across in any organized way. The track that did exist, used by local upland communities for moving sheep to summer pastures, climbed to nearly 2,000 meters along an exposed crest. A man could climb it. A small party could. A division of the imperial army in armor in a single night could not. So the Bulgarian command had assumed. Basil ordered a frontal probe. The Tagmata's heavy infantry moved up the road in close order, scooter locked, and made for the gates under cover of slingers and bowmen firing from the column behind. The Bulgarian archers on the parapet shot down at point-blank range. The chronicle says, in one of its few visual lines on the engagement, that the bolts and arrows came down, quote, 5 __. The Byzantines lost men and pulled back. They tried again the next day on a different angle, sending a party up the southern slope to outflank the position from above. The Slav skirmishers on that ridge held the flank without help and pushed the Byzantines back into the valley with their dead. The hedging line in Skilitzes, quote, 6, usually means several hundred. By the third morning, the Roman army had killed and lost some part of its strength against a wall that had not moved. The Byzantine military tradition, by the standards of the Tactica and the Strategicon, had a clear protocol for a position like this one. If a fortified pass cannot be carried in 3 days, withdraw, find another route, or starve the garrison out. Withdrawal meant going home for the winter with nothing. Going around meant a march of 100 kilometers through hostile upland country that would have taken weeks. Starvation was slow, and the Bulgarian garrison, on its own ground, could be resupplied from the rear. The third option, the one that the protocol did not particularly recommend and that any conventional staff would have written off, was a forced march at night over the supposedly impassable northern ridge. This is the moment in the story where the rifle planted in the first part of this script fires. Basil sent for the strategos Nikephoros Xiphaios. Xiphaios was, by 1014, one of the senior field commanders of the European themes. Skylitzes introduces him without ceremony. The emperor preferred working officers to court men, and the chroniclers wrote for an audience that did not always recognize the names. Xiphaios had spent at least 2 winters with the local upland communities on this stretch of the frontier. Skylitzes, in an aside in a later passage, refers to his familiarity with quote, _7 _. He knew, the chronicle says, of a track. He told the emperor that the ridge could be crossed at night by a force on foot. No baggage, no standards, only weapons, food for 1 day, and water. Basil ordered the move. The chronicle does not record what gesture he made when Xiphaios said yes, only that Xiphaios was ordered to take a strong division, perhaps 10,000 men, perhaps fewer, the sources do not agree, and to start walking, that night, along a goat track that local guides would lead him over. The rest of the army would stay in place at the eastern mouth of the defile, lighting the campfires as normal, keeping the probes against the palisade going at intervals, so that nothing in the Bulgarian sightline changed. Xiphaios's column moved out after dark. The men carried no banners. The torches were extinguished as soon as the head of the column climbed above the valley floor. The track climbed steeply, in switchbacks, through oak and beech. The local guides, whose names the chronicle does not give, and whose loyalties it does not name either, led the column up onto the crest. The crest itself, at nearly 2,000 meters on the highest pitch, was open and exposed, but the night was warm and there was no moon. The chronicle does not name the day. It says only that the column walked all night. By dawn on the next morning, by the inferred chronology, the 28th or 29th of July, 1014, depending on which modern reconstruction you trust, Xiphaios's division was descending the southern slope of the Belasica ridge, behind Samuel's Palisade, into a stretch of forest that opened onto the Bulgarian camp from the rear. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces, this is the work the channel does. There is more of it waiting. Back to the ridge before dawn. The Bulgarian camp at first light, by Skylitzes' account, was loose. Skylitzes uses a word that in the original Greek shades toward quote, _8, The men had been holding the palisade against frontal probes for 3 days, and the rear of their position was where they cooked, slept, and watered the horses. There was no fortification on the rear side. There was no need for one. The slopes were impassable, the consensus had said for 15 years, and the consensus had said the same thing the previous month and the month before that. Siphius hit the rear of the camp at the moment when the night watch was being relieved. The chronicle says the Byzantines came out of the trees in silence and were inside the camp before the alarm could form. The Bulgarian garrison at the Palisade, hearing screaming behind them and the noises of fighting in their own camp, broke formation. The men on the parapet turned to look. Some climbed down, some abandoned the parapet entirely. The chronicle is careful here because it understands the geometry of what happened next. The moment the Bulgarian rear collapsed, the imperial column at the eastern mouth of the defile launched its frontal assault on the now thinly held palisade, with the heavy infantry of the tagmata punching the gate. The Bulgarians inside the works, caught between two wings, fell apart. The trap had closed. What followed in the next several hours, the chronicles describe in fragments that, when reassembled, give us the worst single day in the history of the medieval Bulgarian state, and the precise moment when the columns of 99, walking home through the slopes of the Belasica 4 days later, became possible. The fighting inside the palisade lasted a part of one morning. Skylitzes does not give a duration. He says only that the works were carried. The camp was overrun, and Samuel's army was destroyed. The Tsar himself was inside the palisade when Xiphias's division came down off the ridge. When the rear of the camp collapsed, the men around him, his guards, his son Gabriel Radomir, a number of mounted retainers, got him onto a horse and rode him out, through a part of the line that had not yet broken, into the western mouth of the defile. They reached Prilep, then Strumitsa, then turned west toward Prespa. The chronicle does not name the day Samuel reached his lake. It says only that he reached it alive, and that what waited for him there was the inventory of his own losses. Most of his men had not got out. They were now the property of the Roman emperor. Skylitzes gives the count plainly, 15,000 prisoners, or about that, quote 10, the chronicler's standard hedge for a number he could not personally verify. The figure has been argued by modern Byzantinists for 2 centuries. Paul Stevenson, in his Bulgar Slayer book of 2003, treats it as inflated, perhaps by a factor of 2 or 3. Catherine Holmes, in her 2005 book on Basil's governance, treats Skylitzes as broadly reliable for events on this frontier, because his text shows clear signs of drawing on the records of officers who served there. I lean toward Holmes on the broad outline. A large mass of prisoners was taken, and toward Stevenson on the specific number, which is probably high. Whether the figure was 15,000 or 6,000 or 10, the operational decision the emperor made next was the same. The operational decision was the blinding. Skylitzes describes it without elaboration. Underscore underscore, quote underscore, 11 underscore underscore underscore. The chronicle does not name the camp where the operation was carried out. It does not name the men who held the irons. The standard medieval method, a heated iron pressed on the open eye, is described elsewhere in Byzantine sources in the context of palace punishments. But the volume of the operation at Clydeon, if Skylitzes' number is even half right, would have been beyond anything in the standard repertoire. Modern military historians have generally argued that the chronicle telescopes what was probably a process spread over weeks, with the prisoners moved east, perhaps to Strumitsa, before the work began. The chronicle's silence on the logistics is, again, the kind of silence the genre takes for granted. What the chronicle does not silence is the procession. Skylitzes is specific. The prisoners were divided into groups of 100. 99 of every 100 were blinded in both eyes. The 100th was blinded in one eye only and given the rope and given the direction. They went west, through the slopes of the Belasica, into the upper Strumeshnitsa valley, then north through the upland country toward Samuel's lake. Samuel was at Prilep, or perhaps already at Prespa when the first column arrived. The chronicle is genuinely vague about the place. The arrival itself, however, Skylitzes describes in a single sentence that has survived 1,000 years of recopying intact. When he saw them, the Tsar fell senseless, and within 2 days he was dead. The dating Skylitzes gives, 2 days after the columns reached Prespa, places Samuel's death on the 6th of October, 1014. It was a stroke or a heart attack. The chronicle uses a Greek verb that covers both. He was around 80. He had been at war with Constantinople for almost 40 years. He died, by Skylitzes' line, looking at his own army. The rifle planted in the first part of this script fires here. Basil did not stop on hearing of Samuel's death. He renewed the campaign the next spring. Gabriel Radomir was murdered in August 1015 by his cousin John Vladislav, the boy Samuel had spared in 988, now an adult with a grievance and a knife. John Vladislav held the throne for less than 3 years before he was killed in 1018 in front of the walls of Dyrrhachion. By the spring of that year, the Bulgarian elite were sending envoys. Ohrid, Samuel's capital, the city no Byzantine army had reached for 40 years, opened without a fight. The Tsaritsa Maria, John Vladislav's widow, handed over the imperial regalia in person. Basil treated the magnates well, confirmed many of them in local office, integrated the Bulgarian church under the Patriarchate of Constantinople while leaving its language and liturgy alone, and rode back to Constantinople before autumn. He died 7 years later, in December 1025, planning a campaign to reconquer Sicily. He was buried, by his own written order, not in the imperial mausoleum at the Church of the Holy Apostles, where Macedonian emperors went, but in a small monastic church at the Hebdomon outside the walls, where his soldiers had trained for 40 years. The black monastic tunic he had worn under the purple since the years after the Gate of Trajan was buried with him. The verse epitaph preserved on the tomb referred to his conquests in plain Greek and did not call him Bulgar slayer. That epithet, Stevenson has shown, does not appear in the sources until the 12th century. Holmes accepts the dating, but argues that the name attached, when it did attach, because Clydeon had already done the work in the cultural memory of the soldiers who had been there. I lean toward a synthesis. The operation in 1014 was real. The number was probably smaller than Skylitzes gives. The cold of it was not embellished. The chronicle's prose is too matter-of-fact to be propaganda. Skylitzes is not building a monster. He is reporting an inventory. The shadow of Clydeon runs forward in ways the standard imperial narrative likes to soften. In the next 50 years, the Bulgarian state ceases to exist as a political entity from 1018 until 1185. The Balkan provinces become, on paper and in tax, a piece of the empire from the Danube to the Peloponnese. The Patriarchate of Ohrid is kept alive as an autocephalous church with its own dialect, preserving a Bulgarian identity inside an imperial frame. That preservation is the reason a Bulgarian polity can be rebuilt at all in 1185. In the longer 200, the empire that swallowed Bulgaria overextends on the same logic, is broken by the Seljuks at Manzikert in 1071, loses Anatolia within a decade, and never again fields an army of the size that climbed the Belasica ridge in 1014. The hard Macedonian state Basil built does not outlive him by a generation. The army that won at Clydeon is dissolved by his civilian successors as too expensive. The Bulgarian Second Empire of the Asans, founded in 1185, will fight Constantinople for 2 centuries. The Ottomans will take Adrianople by 1369 and the city itself in 1453, partly because the Balkan resistance Basil had crushed had never quite recovered enough to slow them down. The pass had bought the empire a century, It had not bought it too. There is one detail I want to leave you with. In the small museum at modern Cluj, on a slope above the road, there is a wooden replica of the kind of palisade Samuel had built at Clydeon. The trunks are oak. They are bound with rope. Every July, locals climb up to the museum and stand in front of the palisade in summer heat, and then climb on, up the ridge that Xiphias crossed at night. The pass is silent. The river is shallow. Somewhere down the road, in the direction of Lake Prespa, the wind moves through grass that has covered everything that was once a man. Some defeats become foundations. Some victories become indictments. Some emperors walk a black tunic into a stone box outside the walls. The rest of the chronicle keeps. The next one is already on the channel. I will meet you there.